Welcome to Chapter 4, The Social Psychology of Stratification. This chapter delves into one of the most fundamental aspects of human society, inequality. We often see the outcomes of stratification, differences in wealth, power, prestige, but here we're going to peel back the layers to understand the social psychological processes that create and sustain hierarchies in society. Have you ever noticed that some people seem to dominate conversations or just naturally take charge? It's not always a personality thing. Often, it's about your place on the social ladder. From an interactionist perspective, stratification isn't just a big abstract system. It's something we do and redo on a daily basis. Three key ways interactionists see stratification's impact on us are these. First, social structure shapes who we interact with. Our positions often determine our social circles. For example, imagine two coworkers in a corporate lobby. One is wearing a tailored suit and carrying a portfolio. The other one is in casual attire, carrying work tools. They gravitate toward different social clusters, executives versus support staff, based on visible cues like clothing and setting. Over time, these patterns reinforce class-based interactions. This aligns with the idea that stratification isn't just macro. It's enacted every day in the choices that we make. A second principle of symbolic interaction when it comes to understanding inequality in society is that lower status people often have to take the role of the other more than higher status people. This means that they're constantly trying to understand the perspective of higher status individuals to navigate interactions. For example, a junior employee may carefully observe a manager's body language, phrasing during one-on-one catch-ups. They anticipate questions before they were asked and frame their responses according to what they believe the manager expects, constantly trying to align with the higher status perspective. This ongoing mental simulation helps them navigate hierarchical dynamics more smoothly. Finally, individuals with certain statuses have more power to define situations, even themselves. They set the rules of interaction. For example, in a formal business meeting, the lead executive opens with, "Let's proceed with the agenda." That phrase instantly establishes tone, sets behavioral norms, and the cues implicit in this hierarchy. Subordinates respond by following suit. In that moment, the executive shapes not only the meeting structure, but also the participants' roles in enacting it. This illustrates how status empowers certain individuals to define social situations, even define others. Othering is a form of collective identity work where higher status groups create definitions that make them feel and look superior to other people. In the process, they often obscure the morality of lower status groups, making them seem inherently different or in deficit in some way. Let me tell you about Tay, the racist chatbot. In 2016, this became an example of how bias can be learned and perpetuated even in AI. Microsoft's Tay was designed to converse with people and learn from their input. It quickly began reproducing racist and inflammatory statements because users intentionally fed it biased language. But this showed how collective human input, a form of interaction, could lead to the production of othering. Othering language that, similar to humans, separates people into groups and judges some groups differently than others. Symbolic interaction goes beyond just trying to understand how we contribute to how some people have more in society than others. It's also about how we separate ourselves into groups, and sometimes that leads to inequalities as well. Probably one of the most famous examples in symbolic interaction include Weston Zimmerman's concept of doing gender. They famously argued that gender is a foundational guideline for basic day-to-day social interaction. Specifically, doing gender is the process by which individuals are held accountable to the rules and norms associated with being a man or a woman in any given society. Barry Thorne extends this idea to the concept of border work, where she studied children and found that at very young ages, boys and girls separate and create physical boundaries between them. The concept of doing gender has expanded tremendously since it was first created. Now we talk about the concept of doing difference, and this refers to any kind of inequality and how that's perpetuated during our interactions on a day-to-day basis. This helps us to understand racial and ethnic relations, as well as differences in gender in our day-to-day lives. Together, we combine this into the concept of intersectionality in society. Intersectionality is this idea that each of us carry multiple statuses, some with higher levels of prestige and respect, some with lower level. And it's not as simple as just our race or just our gender or other things. They combine together to create one person. So I'm going to read some variations on different statuses and see if you can conjure what images come to mind and see if there are any feelings you might associate with each of those combinations. Consider, for instance, a young Asian male. What does that conjure in you? How about an old Asian male? Or a young African American woman? How about a young African American male? You see, you can bring multiple things in there. We can bring sexuality. What are some stereotypes we associate with being gay or straight, male or female, and apply all of those things to different races. And we could go into nationalities, and we can find multiple things that are going on. The amazing thing is the human mind has the capacity to immediately conjure feelings and thoughts for each of these sets of statuses all at one time. All of this comes together in this concept of stereotype threat. Stereotype threat really comes out of psychology, but sociologists have embraced it as well. It's an example of how doing difference can impact people in a very profound way. In this case, negative emotions such as fear or anxiety can result when people believe they will be viewed in terms of a negative stereotype associated with their group memberships. This can significantly reduce performance, particularly among African Americans and women in American society. Watch this short clip that I've included in this video today to see a powerful example of an experiment that was done on this topic. The social structure and personality perspective comes at inequality in society from a different angle. However we constructed these inequalities in the last few hundred years in the United States, thousands of years in other cultures and societies, at that point, it's kind of given to us, it's handed to us, and it impacts later inequality afterwards. So they try to look at how our existing inequalities are perpetuated in society over time. A modern example that it's important for you to know is that Caucasians and Asian Americans have half the poverty rate of Latino Americans and African Americans. And this has been a fairly stable thing for many years now. So people are starting in the playing field at a different place than others. The social structure and personality approach explores how our social backgrounds influence major life outcomes above and beyond interactional things we just discussed. I'm going to pause here for a moment to bring a couple models up to you, one of which is the Wisconsin model of status attainment. This one is associated with dozens of research projects, and it's very unique in the history of all the social sciences, in my opinion. But a couple of things I want to point out that are really important. First, the class you're born into has an impact the rest of your life. But one of the major ways that it impacts us the rest of our life is through our aspirations to things we want. People from working class and poor backgrounds have lower aspirations than people in middle and upper class backgrounds. Secondly, our class background impacts the kind of education we seek and get, but also the feedback we get from teachers, parents, and other people. That is to say, people from middle and upper class backgrounds have higher expectations with regard to education. They get supported for those aspirations by their peers, their families, and so forth, and that continues to impact them later in life. Imagine two different people. One graduates from college and is an engineer and works on projects that vary from building buildings to constructing new parking lots and other types of things that require high levels of thinking and very little actual physical work or labor. Another one goes into a career where they're a machinist. There's a lot of thinking that goes along with being a machinist, but you're using your hands every day. It's very physical labor. Do you think those two different types of jobs might produce different outcomes in terms of personality and ways of looking at the world? This is where the Cohn and Schooler model of status attainment come in. They actually did this. They studied people who went into different types of jobs, and they wanted to figure out what would happen after 30 years of working in these different jobs. How would that impact their personality in any way? No surprise, after 30 years, people who went into jobs with high levels of supervision and routinization of work were less flexible and less self-directed than people who went into jobs that gave them more control over their lives. It's almost like our physical worlds controlled our inner worlds, but it takes time for this to happen. So picture a scenario for someone from a working class background going into a middle class job, or a middle class person going into a working class job, and how that might affect them over time. And that's what the Cohn and Schooler model does for us. It actually shows and demonstrates exactly how that would happen after time. We're going to spend most of the rest of our time in this lecture focusing on social exchange theory. You want to get to know social exchange theory very well because we're going to spend the rest of the semester on it. I would argue it's probably one of the best theories we can talk about as well, because you'll see, I think, it's applicable to your day-to-day life, and you'll carry this the rest of your life. Social exchange theory is based on the premise that we enter relationships in order to get something from them, and we leave or end those relationships in which we don't benefit in some way. It's important to know there's two different types of exchanges that occur in these interactions. One is a direct exchange, in which you maybe give somebody something and they get something in return, whether that's love or money or something like this. But there's also indirect exchanges. Sometimes we give something to somebody with nothing really expected in return specifically from that person, but in one way or another, we get it later. This could be karma, but it also could be the idea simply that sometimes we have to give things up, and then later on we get things that we're not expecting. But that explains how we have both most simple relationships in life, the direct exchanges, but also the complexities that we see in society. Some basic principles you should know about exchange theory, because they help to explain why relationships begin and end, and you need to know them all. One is that relationships develop when there's some dependence. So we're not really talking about relationships in society with strangers. There still could be some exchange going on there, but we're really talking about relationships with family, with work, but even government to some degree, right? We pay taxes, but we get something for those taxes in return. Members also act to maximize personal benefit. One major principle here is that we're kind of selfish. Ultimately, we're trying to get more out of this world than we're giving, even though from an exchange theory point of view, most of us get about the same that we give. Another important principle of exchange theory is this idea of reciprocity. That is, we expect about as much in this world as we give. So we'd like to get a little extra maybe, but at the minimum, we're trying to get equal. This other one that I think is super important, that's called the satiation principle. And the idea is that you can have too much of a good thing. And that is, we get bored and we exchange things with people. And even when we get good things from those people, we can get bored and want to get out of those relationships. So things that may have been important to us to get us into a relationship may be less important to us later in life. So it could explain why a good marriage goes bad after a period of time. They got in there with a lot of love and so forth and so on, but to be quite frank, they don't get as much over time, or rather they get the same amount of things, it just doesn't have as much value to them. It also could explain a relationship in terms of business, in which you have a business partner, you're both doing fairly well, but after 10 or 20 years, you kind of get bored with that and you kind of want to move on to something else. So satiation principle is super important, understanding how exchange relationships form, but also how they end as well. Early research in exchange theory found something that I find absolutely incredible. That is, if you throw a bunch of people with the same status, same background together, leaders emerge, status emerges in groups. Some people are given higher levels of status and esteem and respect than others. And you have to ask the question, how was that person selected? And the short answer is the person who got the most status in groups typically was the one who contributed the most to the group. Can you see where exchange theories are operating here? That is, people are exchanging a good, in this case, their help of the group, for status. And what's really amazing to me about that early set of studies is no one asked them to come up with leaders and pick leaders and so forth. It happened very naturally. And this is something that we take as the beginning of how social exchange theory helps us understand how status develops in society in general. So we know this basic dynamic happens with exchange theory and status in society. Well, what about people, like we said at the very beginning, that are born into a certain background? How does that influence these dynamics? And that's what status characteristics theory does for us. Status characteristics theory looks at how status hierarchies form when there are already statuses that people bring into those groups. Remember, the early research focused on people with the same background. So if you take people from different genders, different races, and other statuses, how would that affect exchange processes? And no surprise, people who come in with higher statuses are given more status up front, even sometimes when they contribute more. So it's almost like you need to know going into a group that if you come from a lower status background, you're going to have to fight a little bit harder to get status than someone who already has a medium or a high level status going into that group. This is the basis of status characteristics theory. So leaving this lecture, you want to make sure you understand exchange theory very well, and specifically status characteristics theory, and how it helps us understand how inequalities in society play out in our everyday lives. I think you can see that this has been one of our longer lectures, and that's because, to be honest with you, this is an area of sociological social psychology that is very well studied. We covered some of the major topics here, but there are many things in your chapter that we haven't had time to cover. Hopefully you've learned one thing in this lecture, and that is that stratification is more complex than an us and them, the rich against the poor, one group versus another. It's a complex series of things that occur on multiple levels, including our everyday lives.